Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to our latest Facebook Live broadcast. Joined today with Dave Taylor and myself, Rashid Clark. I'm the marketing specialist at the Riverwood Conservancy. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are across the country. And we've had some really good conversations, some really good presentations over the last few weeks about nature, about our place in the natural world, and we hope to have some really good, lively discussion as well with you today. Kind of an interesting topic as we are looking at can nature recover, especially in the context of COVID-19, which is obviously still a big part of our lives. It has had a positive effect in many ways on the natural world because humans have kind of withdrawn from the natural world as a result of COVID. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that today. Of course, we want to get your opinions and your questions. So if you have a question or a comment at any point throughout the presentation today, please type it into the comment section and we'll get to your questions and comments at the end of the presentation from Dave Taylor. And Dave, as you know, is a wildlife photographer and author of more than 40 books on wildlife and ecology, and he's produced educational videos and material about wildlife for school curriculums. And of course, he's been an integral part of the Riverwood Conservancies for many years now. And of course, because of COVID, we are still dealing with the financial ramifications of not being able to have our normal fundraising events this summer. So if you have the financial means, of course, we would very much appreciate a donation to keep programs like this going and to help us come back strong when we can get back into Riverwood. You can make a donation at our website, theriverwoodconservancy.org. So our presentation today, Can Nature Recover, led by Dave Taylor. Dave, I will throw things over to you.
Thanks, Rashid. I appreciate your introduction. So let's begin with an artifact, because that seems to be the way we start. This, in case you're not aware of it, is an elk antler. Actually, it's part of the elk skull. This elk died out west someplace. But it raises the question, we once had elk here in southern Ontario, and in fact in Mississauga. And the question is, when we talk about wildlife recovery, what exactly do we mean, and what sort of recovery can we expect? So, do we want elk back in Riverwood? Do we want elk back in Mississauga? And is that even possible? So we're going to take a look at wildlife recovery, particularly, and nature recovery. And I'm aware as I start this conversation that it's going to be probably the most controversial of all of the talks we've done. I remember many years ago, I wrote an article for Ontario Out of Doors on wolves. And it was a very neutral article. It basically said wolves do this and wolves do that. They kill animals, they raise their young. And of all of the material I've ever written, it was the most controversial because, got a phone call coming in, because it just got people on both sides of the coin arguing against it. They were saying wolves are bad, wolves are good. Nobody was happy with the article because it was fairly neutral. So we're going to go down that road again, and wildlife recovery is controversial. So I'm going to switch to the slides, and we're going to start with a case study. And here we go. There we are. So we're going to start with white-tailed deer. Now, white-tailed deer make a really good case study for us. If we take a look at the range of the white-tailed deer back in the Pleistocene time, about 3 million years ago, they were fairly much confined to the southern part of the United States. As the ice age melted and moved back, white-tailed deer expanded their range to cover most of the United States and a fair chunk of Canada. They were limited by the environment that would support them. So white-tailed deer, when the settlers arrived here in the 1600s, the first people, were very numerous. There were probably, they reckon, 18 million of these animals. And they ranged in size from the tiny little key deer found in the Florida Keys, which is about the size of a large dog, to deer that are found out west. This is Coues white-tailed deer, to the northern white-tailed deer, which we have here in Ontario, and it is the largest of the species of white-tailed deer, subspecies of white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are known because their tails, when they flash them up, show white. White-tailed deer during the time of the Native Americans were basically used for food and for clothing, and they were despised in a way as vermin. The natives, the indigenous people, thought of the white-tailed deer as a problem because it competed with them for food. It ate their corn, it ate their maize, it ate their other crops. So unlike the analogy that you get today, the indigenous people preferred wolves because they ate deer, and they despised deer because they ate their food. That would change as it got settled. There was no hunting season back in those days. The fawns were taken as much as the adult does. There was no particular time, except perhaps when the skin was particularly ratty, which would be in the early spring. So the deer and the people lived together. As I say, there were probably 18 million deer here when the settlers arrived. And when the settlers arrived, that would change because the settlers brought a new way of thinking. They brought cattle, they brought domesticated animals. They also brought something that would ravage the native population. We think that COVID is very serious and very, very serious, but the diseases like measles and chickenpox and smallpox that the Europeans brought over to the indigenous population ravaged them so that 1 in 3 of the native peoples died out. And ironically, this was happening before the settlers arrived. In 1600, sailing along the east coast of North America, the fishermen noticed Indian village after Indian village after Indian village along the coast. When the Puritans arrived at Plymouth Rock, they found the land empty. There was no people there. And what had happened is the indigenous folks had died out in mass because of diseases that the fishermen brought ashore when they landed. And this probably started back in Newfoundland around 1000 when the Vikings arrived. So it's been insidious. Anyhow, what happened was with the dying off of the indigenous people, wildlife populations surged. They surged to numbers never before seen. The bison herds out west increased because there was no human predators on them, or very few. White-tailed deer population expanded. Everything expanded. Elk in Ontario, their numbers grew. And the other thing that the Europeans found was the world was pristine. There were places where they could literally drive a horse and buggy even without clearing the land because the indigenous people had cleared the land, but there were no indigenous people here. And this would give rise to a myth, the myth of wild Ontario, wild Canada, wild North America. It became this pristine thing where wildlife was abundant. Bison were found in the Appalachians. They were found in Buffalo, New York, never in Ontario. And this myth, because nobody knew any better, was perpetuated and kind of colored our wildlife decisions. We thought basically from the 1600s until the 1900s that wildlife was unlimited. Then we eliminated the bison and we eliminated other species. For the white-tailed deer, they were considered an ideal candidate for market hunting, and they were shot whenever. So as Ontario cleared, white-tailed deer moved north. They moved north with the people. As they cleared the land, they created habitat. As the land was taken over through battles and was civilized, railroads were built, and logging started. The deer moved further north into logging country up to what we now think of as Algonquin Park. But a strange thing happened. All of the deer that were in southern Ontario were shot out. You could go in 1900 to a marketplace in, say, Leamington, and you could buy deer. They were there for sale. There was no hunting season, but the deer population was crashing. And by the 1920s, there were no deer. Now, one of the places that I used to go to photograph deer was Rondo National Park, Rondo Provincial Park, sorry, in southern Ontario. And it was loaded with deer. But 60, 70 years ago, there wasn't a deer there to be seen. Now we had a strange situation. We had deer in the north in the logging area, and gradually they moved south into Ontario, into southern Ontario, and there were some deer crossing over from the States. So the white-tailed repopulated Ontario. Now, why did that happen? Well, we started to manage the deer. In the late 1800s, they started putting in restrictions on hunting when people could hunt. The idea of market hunting would be set aside. It was no longer going to be allowed. It wasn't something that people could do. They put in seasons. And this diagram shows the dip. You can see in the 1500s, they're showing 30 million deer. By 1800, it was about 18 million. And then it drops to almost zero. Like white-tailed deer were disappearing, which is hard to believe. If you drive around most places today, you'll see deer. But then in 1900, they began throughout North America, not just Ontario, to establish hunting seasons. And what that did was it protected the does and the fawns. It set limits on what could be hunted and what couldn't be hunted. And as a result, the deer population began to expand till it achieved and then surpassed the numbers of deer that were here in 1800. So hunting is an important tool in wildlife recovery. And I think you can argue that our wildlife has been recovering since they started to put in hunting seasons. Now, if you don't hunt, back in those days, you didn't value wildlife. It wasn't like you could get out and see it, because most people were limited. They might go up north by train, but there wasn't a lot of wildlife. Yellowstone was an attraction, Banff was an attraction. But with the beginning of the hunting seasons and the management, that changed everything. And in the 1960s, black bear were put on the hunting list. And their population has pretty much tripled in Ontario since they were added to the hunting regime. Because again, there was protection. Only certain animals could be taken, males over females, and the population increased. And people were spending hunting dollars on wildlife. Ducks Unlimited was created because ducks were disappearing. Ducks Unlimited in the States and Canada bought up marshlands, protected farmland, wetlands, and allowed ducks to have a habitat. And the ducks increased. And by providing habitat for ducks, they also increased habitat for other wildlife, which helped them. I was born in 1948, and I would say that in the 72 years that I've been around, it's been the best years in the history of humankind for seeing wildlife. In my life, I've been able to travel to Africa and watch wildebeest migrate, travel to Australia, travel to South America and the Galapagos, because people have begun to take an interest in wildlife, and we had the means of getting there. You could travel by plane or train or car to see these things. And the wildlife was there because people valued it. This is a little slide that shows the various hunting seasons. So white-tailed deer first had hunting seasons as far back as the 1600s, but it was very limited and wasn't well established. And now we have 1921, the season set, and it begins the recovery of the deer. Same thing with coyotes. Coyotes were considered vermin for a long time and shot on sight. Today they are managed as a fur bearer and as a sporting animal. Same with black bear. So we can argue, I think, that we have had some success with wildlife and wildlife recovery. The wolf was reestablished in Yellowstone in 1985, and since then, I think it's 85, 95 perhaps. And since then, it has recovered to the point where wolves are well established. But even before that, wolves were recovering in places like Minnesota and other places across the United States and Canada they were re-entering the United States. They were doing well in Alaska. Now, wolf recovery is fairly controversial because there are people that think the only good wolf is a dead wolf, and there are people that think the only good wolf is the wolf that I can look at and see and know that it's out there. Wildlife recovery is a double-edged sword. Again, we were able to completely eradicate wolves in the United States, except for a small population in northern Minnesota, which spilled over from Canada. They did that by trapping and poisoning them. But given a chance, the wolves can make a comeback. The coyote was quick to exploit the absence of wolves because wolves killed coyotes, we talked about earlier, and they expanded their range. But even now, there is coyote control put in place. Coyotes are more numerous in Mississauga and the GTA than they are in Algonquin Park. Black bear numbers, as I've said, have expanded. This is the black bear range today, covering most of North America. But it was once contracted into in the 1900s. There were much fewer places where black bear were found. Now, black bear kind of owe their resurgence to hunting regulations, but they also owe their resurgence to new ways of farming. As farming got better and better and better, we didn't need as much farmland. In places like Vermont, and even Ontario, farmland went out of pasture and reverted back into wildlands. And as it did that, the bears re-entered those areas and were able to reestablish populations. And they do so by young male bears being chased out of the territory, wander around, finding a place. They settle into it. Eventually, a female bear wanders into it, and a breeding population starts. And we're seeing that happening in southern Ontario. We're seeing that happen in the United States, down in Texas and places. The black bear is starting to reestablish its range. Thanks in part because we are better at producing our own food. Now, not all animals are success stories. The caribou, which was once found in Algonquin Park, even down here in southern Ontario, has seen its range restricted as the climate has changed. And there are still huge herds of caribou. But the caribou herds seem to be declining. And then sometimes they seem to expand again. Whether this is a cyclic sort of thing or whether it has to do with climate change and overhunting or wolf control. I mean, in Alaska, they are trying to control wolves by shooting them from helicopters so that the caribou population will grow. But there are some studies that suggest that that's not a factor at all. So, and then there's cougars. Cougars have made a tremendous resurgence since we've become more tolerant of predators. There are about 30,000 cougars now living in North America. And yes, they are found in Ontario. And although some of those were no doubt releases of captive cougars, there is no question that wild cougars have repopulated northwestern Ontario. There's not a lot of them, but they're there. And then we get back to the elk. One of the things that we have done successfully in Ontario after several attempts that failed was we have reintroduced elk into the province, particularly in the Bancroft area. Elk are not numerous there, but they are expanding. I think there's probably 100, 150, but I'm not sure that that figure is correct. I haven't seen anything for this year. They do expect them to finally, at some point in the next few years, if they haven't already, begin to show up in Algonquin Park, which is interesting because originally elk were introduced in Algonquin Park back in the 1920s, but they died out. But the climate has changed and is probably more favorable now for elk to reestablish themselves. They're grazers more than twig eaters, so they need grassy areas. And Yellowstone doesn't provide, Algonquin doesn't provide a lot of that, but Bancroft does. There have been successful rehabilitations or reintroductions of elk down in the United States, particularly in Pennsylvania. And it's a great place if you want to see elk bugling to go down there in the fall. St. Mary's. Smaller folks have kind of gone through a resurgence and a contraction. The arrival of coyotes in the GTA has reduced, I believe, the number of groundhogs. But so have our actions. We used to have groundhogs at Riverwood. Then when we built the McEwen Gardens, the groundhogs disappeared. And although one or two have been seen, they don't seem to have been able to establish a population. But groundhog in general are doing okay throughout the province. Prairie dogs were once innumerable, numbering in the billions. They were reduced down to a few 100,000. Their range is slowly expanding as they're being reintroduced into areas that they once populated. Beaver. When I was a kid back in the 1950s, it was against the law for a beaver to exist south of Highway 401. Fortunately, beavers can't read laws very well and don't obey them because they're well established, and there are several active beaver lodges along the shores of Lake Ontario now. They've reestablished themselves. At one time, they were virtually extinct because they were trapped out. They were the commerce of North America, probably until about the 1830s, from the 1650s through the 1830s, when the demand for beaver hats, felt hats, finally died out. And the beaver were slowly starting to population regrowth. Beavers are now being reintroduced into Scotland, of all places, where they were once found, because beavers are very, very important to managing water levels. A lot of people don't realize it, but beavers are found in deserts where there's some water streams or water courses. And what they find is when a beaver dams up a stream in the desert or dry area, the underground water seeps out for acres beyond what the water you can see. And this helps refurbish things and helps control flooding and does all sorts of good things and cleans up the river. So beavers are making a comeback, and I think that's a good thing. We can reintroduce species. The horse was originally from North America. It evolved here, crossed over the Bering Land Bridge to Asia, and died out for some reason, and nobody's really quite sure. Climate change, lack of habitat. But the horse died out in North America, became established in Asia and Africa and Europe, and then was brought back by the Spaniards in the 1500s. And they escaped, and they have reestablished themselves. People don't necessarily want horses to be reestablished, but if you wanted to rewild Yellowstone, the animals that you could put back there that would have been there in the Pleistocene period, you would put horses back. You could reintroduce American lions there because there were lions here. Possibly even bring in cheetahs because there was a type of cheetah here in North America. Now, will people ever do that? Probably not. I don't see Yellowstone bringing back in African lions to return to the way it was. But it does raise the interesting question. At Riverwood, we've asked the question, if you want to restore Riverwood, what are you going to restore it to? Are you going to restore it to 1920 when it was farmland? Are you going to restore it to 1810 when it was a forest and that forest was temperate, Southern Ontario temperate type forest? Or do you want to go back further to say the 1200s and restore it as a pine forest? These are decisions that you have to make. We talk about restoring the savanna, the oak savanna to places like High Park. Well, the oak savanna existed because indigenous peoples set fire to create habitat for wildlife. Do we want to restore it to that point? Or do we want to go back further? These are questions that plague a lot of places, and setting sort of the picture you have is really important. We're doing, for instance, at Riverwood, a restoration of Carolinian forest. It's a small garden by the Chapel House, and it's an attempt to restore the Carolinian forest. Now, it does have some bearing on climate change because the Carolinian forest was here when the climate was warmer, then it cooled during the Little Ice Age, and we're kind of playing around with the notion to see if it can be reestablished. And so far, it's doing okay. So we can do it, but the question is, to what level do we want to do it, and where are we going to do it? And this is something that people need to think about before they say we want to restore nature. Do you want black bears back in Riverwood? Do you want elk back in Riverwood? I would suggest the answer probably is no. We have done things like set up ranges for bison. There is the notion of a bison common, which I think is an exciting notion. It is the idea that from Texas all the way up to Banff in Alberta, along the edge of the Rockies, there will be this bison range. It'll be run by indigenous people who will be able to hunt the bison and take products from them as they have historically done, traditionally done. It's a dream, but there are pockets of it already established. And along with that dream, it sees the reestablishment of grizzly bears, because grizzly bears are part of the plains, and elk and wolves. And it's an exciting idea, and I hope one day it comes to fruition. Bison would be a wonderful asset. But even without doing the bison common, bison, which were numbered less than 100 over 100 years ago, are now numbering 500,000, 500,000 bison, most of those on ranches. I want to talk a little bit briefly about sea life. There's been a lot of controversy about orcas in aquariums. But the orcas in aquariums truly were ambassadors for whales. And people hooked onto the idea of whales as being an important animal. And because of that, there developed whale watching opportunities on the East Coast. And because of the interest in whales, moratoriums were placed in a lot of countries against hunting humpback whales and other whales. And as a result of that, the humpback whale population has come back remarkably. There are still some whale species that need a lot of help, and they need protection, not only while they're in North American waters, but when they're in the world waters. There are still countries that allow the hunting of whales. But whales have benefited from tourism. If you want to help whales recover and other animals recover, go pay money to see them, because you're voting with your dollars. When the fishing industry in Newfoundland went belly up because the cod numbers declined, they've come back fortunately, but when they did decline, a lot of fishermen turned to whale watching. And boy, they've done well. The tours are really good. You can see a lot of whales. Wildlife tourism is really important. The parks in Africa, I remember when I was a kid in the 50s, I was told by the 60s there won't be any elephants or lions or wildebeest left to see. The populations are going to be gone. But that's when people started to take photography safaris. And with those safaris, not to hunt the animals, but to look at them and see them, suddenly the wildlife had value. And the Maasai, on the edge of the Masai Mara people, they have created a common area around the park where they invite tourists in to stay in their lodges, and they go out and see the wildebeest and the lions that now roam freely on those properties. Alligators recovered simply because they were placed on the Endangered Species Act, which was a great thing. And watch, because people are working against the Endangered Species Act to weaken it so we can build roads, so we can build houses. I think that's a real dangerous road to go down. We need to keep the teeth in the Endangered Species Act, both here in Canada and in the United States. Alligators, given half a chance, breed like alligators. They have a lot of babies. There are well over 1 million alligators, I think, just in Florida. And they're doing quite well. Whooping cranes required a lot of intervention by people to be recovered. There was only a very few, and we had no idea where they were mating and breeding until they discovered their breeding areas up in Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park. One of the more interesting things is that they figured out very quickly that whooping cranes typically lay 2 eggs, one of which is like the backup baby in case the first one doesn't survive. So by going in and taking these additional eggs, they didn't reduce the breeding population, but they would take this egg and they would put it under a sandhill crane nest, and the sandhill crane would hatch that baby, and that crane, when it hatched, grew up to be a whooping crane with whooping crane tendencies. And then they started to train them how to fly to migrate to Florida and Louisiana, and then back up to places where they breed. So we now have whooping cranes. They're established, but they're not numerous. We're not talking thousands of whooping cranes. We're talking a few hundred, but they are making a comeback and they are secured. So it is now possible to go to places like Texas, but even Florida, and see whooping cranes down there during the winter with their young. And then there's other animals. Moose have been a relatively recent arrival in North America. They didn't arrive until after the Ice Age ended. Their numbers, particularly if you go up to Algonquin Park, you will remember the days, if you were there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where you could see a lot of moose. I remember one spring trip, we saw 90 moose in about 24 hours. Calves, cows, bulls. You wouldn't be able to see that today. The moose population has dropped considerably. Why has it dropped? The habitat has changed. The winters have changed. Moose don't like warmer weather. White-tailed deer and moose do not get along. So the moose was able to get into Algonquin Park and establish itself in larger numbers because the white-tailed deer died off. White-tailed deer carry a parasite called a brainworm. When they pass the brainworm out in their droppings, the eggs hatch, they crawl up in plants, and should a moose eat one of those plants with a brainworm larva in it, the larva goes into the moose's brain and causes it to have, well, they call it circling disease, and the moose basically die of it. So Algonquin got too cold in the 60s, 50s, and 60s for the white-tailed deer. The forest got taller, white-tailed deer moved out, they were less numerous, moose moved in. Now we're seeing a change back where the white-tailed deer are starting to move back in and the moose are starting to decrease. The other thing that's happened is the Algonquin wolf, which is a smaller type of wolf, but still a wolf, has learned how to prey on moose. So they're taking some moose too. And truth is, the moose are also hunted in Algonquin Park by the indigenous people. They have treaty rights to hunt there. So there's been a lot of factors involving moose. Sea otters. Sea otters were almost extinct in California. They were reintroduced, and then they were reintroduced in British Columbia. They have been a positive success story in some ways, although there was some concern in California that they were damaging the kelp forest and changing the environment. Of all things, kitties, your kitty cat and your dog were killing sea otters. Not by actually attacking them, but their feces and other contaminants from the land were being washed in, and they were carrying diseases, which caused a decline in the sea otters. So places that were attracting people to see sea otters, like Monterey Bay, have had to clean up the way they process things and manage their cats and dogs better. In British Columbia, the problem has been different. Again, the sea otters are doing some damage to the environment, but it's a $90 million tourism industry for people coming to British Columbia to see sea otters and grizzly bears and black bears, and so they're worth their weight literally in gold. Seals have had a tremendous response simply because we stopped hunting them. Protection was given to sea mammals so that fishermen could not just shoot them because they felt they were competing with seals. So as a result, the seals have expanded their range, their numbers are up. When I was going to Maine back in the 80s, hardly would ever see a seal. Now they're very common. Along the California coast, they're everywhere. You can see seals up in Iceland. They're doing very well. And these are harbor seals, and they're very tolerant of warmer waters. Ironically, they're also helping restore white shark populations and attracting white sharks to these areas because white sharks feed on seals. So with the growth of seals and sea lions, the white shark population has come up. Elephant seals, 100 of them left in the world 150 years ago. A naturalist for crying out loud, is out in a boat in Mexico, sees 9 elephant seals, and as far as he knows, they're the last elephant seals on Earth, and he shoots all 9 of them because he wanted them for specimens. But he didn't find the remaining ones, and today they number over 100,000, and they can be easily seen along the California coast, and they're establishing colonies up and down the coast. Just an amazing success story, given some protection and some habitat, and again, wildlife viewing. Not all stories with sea life and sea lions are positive. The Steller sea lions are declining in number. They think they're declining in number because of climate change. Climate change has changed the habitat of the fish that the Steller sea lions prey on. So the Steller sea lions are not finding as much food, and their population is down. Whether they will bounce back, whether they have resilience or plasticity, that's a term for animals that can take a lot of change, remains to be seen. California sea lions, however, are much more tolerant of warmer waters and seem to be faring very well. So, who knows? So, to sum up, just about the big game animals, white-tailed deer population over 30 million, black bear population close to 1 million, up from 450,000, coyote population likely over 1 million, gray wolves are over 70,000, grizzly bears 150,000 plus. There's a lot of success stories out there. And I think at this point, we'll take questions because I'm sure there'll be some.
Absolutely. And Dave, thanks again for another terrific presentation. Lots to think about in terms of, just our connection to nature and what human activity does in terms of species numbers. So first question that we'll get to coming from Cindy, what benefits are expected of the Carolinian forest to Riverwood, both in the short term now and maybe 5 or so years from now?
I don't know that we're looking for benefits specifically. It will increase the diversity of Riverwood, and by increasing the diversity, it will make Southern Ontario a little bit more responsive to climate change. One of the things that's happening with climate change is greater flooding, and the Credit River floor valley is being inundated by bigger floods. One of the biggest and worst floods I've ever seen happened there this year. It's drowning our forests out, and that's going to change the makeup. And those forests talk about resilience, they've only been there since 1954 when Hurricane Hazel hit and flooded it and created the Credit Valley Conservation Authority and other authorities to manage the river. And so it was allowed, cattle were no longer allowed down there, people couldn't live in the valley, and the forest has come back. So that has been a really good thing. But we need diversity down there. The maples, or the willows and some of the other trees that have survived there during a drier time are having a tough time doing it. So by increasing the diversity of Riverwood, that means that we'll be able to respond better to changes in the environment. And trees are going to be a real thing, because the trees will cause the air to go higher, cool it off, give us more rainfall, reduce evaporation, and just change things for the better. So we hope that there is some change, but I can't tell you specifically what we want them to do.
And we touched on the idea of hunting a number of times throughout the presentation as a way that humans and wildlife interact, and how that influences numbers. Of course, the biggest driver, or the biggest example of human intervention, I guess, in the natural world right now would be climate change. So when we think about climate change and all of its overarching effects, how will that affect the future of wildlife?
Climate change is going to be a double-edged sword. As species evolve, when we're talking about plants or animals, as they evolve, some species tend to become more specialist. So the polar bear is a specialist, and climate change is probably going to impact it more than the black bear. Black bears probably are going to be fine. They live in Florida, they live in Labrador. The species tolerates a wide range of climates. They live in a wide range of habitats. So this is called plasticity, as I said earlier. They have a plastic behavior pattern. Animals like black bear and deer are going to do fine. Animals like certain species of warbler or maybe woodpeckers who do not have the ability to feed on diverse foods are going to be more heavily impacted. The other thing that you have to remember is it's not just what we do in Ontario. I mean, Ontario's doing a pretty good job. I got some issues with some of the things, but they're doing pretty good. We've got eagles back. But our songbirds migrate down to Brazil. And Brazil is busily burning down the rainforest. And that's causing climate change. So they're removing habitat. They're making the climate drier. They're removing some of the food for the birds. They're also, by the way, spraying DDT to control mosquitoes, which, given the choice of killing some birds or killing some people, you're probably going to go with killing some birds with the DDT. So there are changes that are outside of our area that are affecting our area. We're doing a pretty good job, but this is a worldwide problem. And the species like the monarch butterflies that migrate to Mexico, the birds that migrate to Brazil, they're species that may get more impact than we want them to have due to climate change. But other species will do just fine. Polar bear is adapting more than people thought it would. It's finding grizzly bears to mate with, but it's also adapting more of a grizzly bear lifestyle by eating plants, and there's possibilities there. Polar bears have been through climate change before and have crossbred with grizzly bears before, and originally were a grizzly bear. So polar bears may not be the disaster story, but it sure makes a good picture of a starving polar bear in an iceberg. That's manipulating things a bit, I think. But I'm going to trouble with that.
At the same time, it's the kind of image that does spark action in some people that might otherwise not be too interested in other matters of climate change and the environment. Getting back to Riverwood and the GTA more specifically, is there any species of animal that's not doing so well in Riverwood and the Greater Toronto Area in terms of their numbers?
Yes, and there are actually several. Look to the amphibians first, the spring peepers. When I moved into my house, which is not too far from Riverwood, we would hear spring peepers every year. We would hear even toads quite close to the house. That's changed. The spring peeper disappeared probably in the late 70s, as far as I know. The gray tree frog, the last one was heard when I was at Riverwood, or in my first few years back, 2003, 2004. It's disappeared. Rough grouse have disappeared. The groundhog has disappeared from Riverwood. It's still in the GTA. Species are disappearing, and some of them we can bring back and some of them we can't. The flying squirrel used to be found here in the GTA. It may still be found in some areas, but I haven't heard of flying squirrel in Mississauga for a long time. Porcupines have pretty much disappeared. The last porcupine I saw in the GTA was at Clairville, and that would have been 40 years ago. Now I don't go looking for porcupines, so I don't know that they're not there. But there are species that are not doing so well, and yet other species are doing very well, like the pileated woodpeckers. They need old growth forests. Well, Riverwood's getting old, and it's helping the pileated woodpecker. And so it's a mixed story. There's going to be some positives and negatives. Coyotes will decline in number because of distemper and other diseases, and then they'll come back. So you also have natural fluctuations. But yeah, we've lost some species, and some species are coming back on their own.
I'm going to test your numbers knowledge right now with a question of I'm curious here. How many moose? I'm going to guess that the word there is moose and not moose, and then referring to cows. So I'm gonna go and guess that the question is how many moose and white-tailed deer are in the world today?
Well, white-tailed deer, I think you can be pretty specific and say about 30 million. That's what the figures are for Canada and the United States. Now, if you want to get really technical, there are a lot of white-tailed deer in South America because they migrated south across the land bridge that goes through Costa Rica. And there are several species of white-tailed deer, not all of them called whitetail. I have no idea what their population is, and I would think it would be unreasonable to guess. And the same with moose. There are 4 races of moose in Canada. They're numerous in Newfoundland and Ontario, and they're doing well. I've not seen any figures for the number of moose in North America, but I would suggest it's significant, although there have been declines. But then moose, which are called, of all things, elk, in Europe and Russia, are pretty common and can be seen in Sweden and Norway and across Russia and other countries. The best place in the world to see wolf is probably in Europe, of all places. Europe has more wolves than Yellowstone does in a similar area in some places. It's just amazing. And that's a true wildlife recovery. And they're coming right into towns. But I'm sorry, I can't answer your question about moose. Just a brief reason why moose are called moose here and elk are called elk. When the Europeans came over, they were familiar with moose, with the broad palmated antlers. The first animal they happened to see when they arrived in North America that had big antlers was the elk. Now in Europe, the moose was called elk, so they just naturally assumed that this animal here was an elk. And then they found the moose, which got its name from the Algonquin term for twig eater. And that's how we got the confusion. Europeans, when they got here, weren't the brightest about naming animals, but then science was in its infancy. It wasn't really being studied too well.
We'll get to a couple more questions before we wrap for today. So if you do have anything more questions for Dave or any comments just on the topic that we've been discussing, please type them into the comment section right now. One more question from Cindy. What animal would you like to see reintroduced? And what might be the most beneficial, whether that's Riverwood specific or just to larger ecosystems? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I hope I'm around for the day when a black bear shows up, because that would mean that so many things have gone right, that we've reforested the Credit River Valley and that black bears were doing well. But I don't think it would be a popular choice for most people to have a black bear living in Mississauga. So that's not really a good answer. The animal I'd most like to see reintroduced, I would love to see flying squirrels. Because if we could put flying squirrels back, it would mean that the forest now covers the entire river. So if you walk down the river, the Credit River, you'll see trees on either side, but they don't canopy over the forest. A flying squirrel cannot get from one side of the river to the other side of the river. It needs that contiguous forest, that canopy. And if we had that canopy created, that would shade the river. And by shading the river, it would cool the river. And if we could cool the river, we could get Atlantic salmon coming back in and breeding successfully, which would be great. And I'd like to see them back. So I guess maybe it's not an animal, but it's a type of tree that can survive along the river and grow across and shade it. And it would have to be up and down because that's really necessary. But those conditions, if they are met, and I hope one day that they will be met, it won't be in my lifetime because the trees won't grow that fast, but it could be in your lifetime. That'd be wonderful to reintroduce flying squirrels, and they're beautiful little animals.
And to tie everything back to just what we as people can do, in this situation, in helping wildlife recover. Last question that I'll pose to you today is, what can I or what can we in our community do to help wildlife recover?
Number one, I think, is support wildlife by letting your politicians know that it matters to you that we have beaver in the Credit River, that our deer are important, that places like Riverwood and Credit Valley Conservation are important to you, and other conservation areas and parks, because that means that you are going to support spending money on them. I would also strongly suggest that you support education. COVID is, and this is a little self-serving because of what the Riverwood Conservancy does, but it is important for our kids to get out in nature. When I was a teacher, it was like, if not a weekly event, it was at least a couple of times a month. My classes would go out, but I was fortunate to have taught at Aaron Mills Senior and at Hazel McCallion, where I had a woodlot that was adjacent and I could take my kids out. Encourage your teacher to take your kids out. And a lot of teachers, honestly, are comfortable in the classroom. That's their kingdom. One of the things that when we came into Riverwood, the first teacher that we hired was Rita Schulze. She and I both were of the mind that if we can get teachers to come to Riverwood and learn how to be comfortable in the outdoors, and that they will take their kids out, even if they never came back to Riverwood, we were doing them a service. And we did have some success with some teachers, not very many, but we had some success. So getting your kids outdoors, even as a parent, taking your kids and walking the trails at Riverwood or at Meadowvale or taking them to Algonquin Park, really important. Other things you can do, support good wildlife management. Make sure the Endangered Species Act is important to you. Support the restoration of species. The support hunting. Hunting still is the #1 driver of a lot of conservation efforts because people want to, ironically, shoot the animals. They want them to be around. But if you don't like that, make sure you vote by going and doing stuff like go on a fishing trip up north. Go to Algonquin Park and go camping and enjoy the wildlife. If you can afford it, go on safari to Africa. And if you can't afford going on safari, watch the BBC Earth Network or something and enjoy a National Geographic special on wildlife. There are a couple of ways of looking at conservation. The late John Livingston, who was the original host, or one of the original hosts of Nature Things on CBC, he taught at York University, and his approach to managing wildlife and wild places was nobody should go there. Not a photographer, not a camper, nobody. It should be left pristine. And there is some strength in that. That's a way of looking at things. But I think it's more important. I kind of like Norman Meyer's idea, and he wrote a book called The Long African Day. And in it, he argues that if people pay for wildlife, wildlife will be valued. And people paying to go and see wildlife, to feed the birds, to go to a trip someplace to see animals in Florida or go to the zoo or whatever, come to Riverwood, that is speaking volumes to the importance. And as long as we do that, I think wildlife is fine. We have problems. Climate change is going to change things. There's no question. The developers are going to want to take over and build over marshes and cut through Jefferson salamander habitat. We have to fight against them, but we also have to recognize that where you live, where I live, was once habitat. And we have to strike a balance between our needs and wildlife needs. But I will say this in closing: the more diverse Ontario's wildlife, and wildlife in the sense of natural resources, plants to animals, any living thing, the more diverse that is, the healthier we will be, and the better we will be able to cope with change, because we'll have that plasticity to be able to respond. Eliminate something, you might be eliminating the cure for COVID-19. Eliminate something, you might be eliminating a species that will be important to control rats coming into your backyard. You know, we need to really get out there and vote and do things. So join me for a photography course and we'll go out and take pictures of animals. I don't know. Just get out and do things. And come to Riverwood and support Riverwood. And
good advice for everybody is to come to Riverwood, and a reminder for people, a little self-serving, but I mean, I think ultimately it does help people appreciate nature and wildlife, certainly. And just a reminder for everyone that the parking lots at Riverwood are once again open. We are encouraging people to come out and use the trails, but at the same time, still please do maintain your proper physical distancing between yourself and other visitors, because yes, we are still living in the world of COVID-19, but we want people to be able to enjoy nature safely. So Dave, once again, thank you for another exceptional presentation, and thanks to everyone who joined in today for the questions, the comments, or just to watch. And please stay safe. We'll talk to you again soon. Have a good one.
Take care, folks. We'll be back.